In Chapter 2, Mankani argues that Dawkins primarily targets the Judeo-Christian conception of God, particularly Yahweh from the Old Testament. Dawkins describes this God as, quote, arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, unquote. Mankani points out that Dawkins seems unaware that other faiths conceptualize God very differently. For example, Muslim theologians view God as the source of all goodness and perfection, devoid of flaws like cruelty or injustice. In their view, a being with such negative traits would be unworthy of the title God. The critique also highlights a contradiction in Dawkins' approach. While Dawkins claims, quote, I am not attacking any particular version of God or gods, I am attacking God, all gods, anything and everything supernatural, wherever and whenever they have been or will be invented. But Dawkins later admits, quote, unless otherwise stated, I shall have Christianity mostly in mind, but only because it is the version with which I happen to be most familiar, unquote. Mankani here questions how Dawkins can claim to attack all gods while admittedly being unfamiliar with conceptions of God outside Christianity. Dawkins then defines the God hypothesis that he wishes to demonstrate as false. Quote, there exists a superhuman, supernatural intelligence who deliberately designed and created the universe and everything in it, including us. Unquote. Mankani criticizes this definition and says that it is problematic because using superhuman implies viewing God only in relation to human attributes. In contrast, Mankani notes that the Islamic conception of God describes a being so far removed from his creation that no comparisons are possible. Terms like superhuman would be entirely inadequate in such a theological framework. Dawkins compounds this problem by asserting any creative intelligence of sufficient complexity to design anything comes into existence only as the end product of an extended process of gradual evolution. Creative intelligence being evolved necessarily arrive late in the universe and therefore cannot be responsible for designing it. God, in the sense defined, is a delusion. Mankani considers this statement absurd, revealing Dawkins' ignorance about the concept of a necessary being. And he emphasizes that the very concept of evolution and change is incompatible with the notion of a necessary being who is perfect, completely actualized, with no potential for change or evolution. Mankani refutes Dawkins' claim that the God hypothesis is founded on local traditions of private revelation rather than evidence. He explains that revelation has never been considered evidence for God's existence in theological traditions, nor could it logically serve as such. Using revelation to prove God would be circular reasoning. One must already believe in God to accept a prophet's claim of divine revelation. Otherwise, the revelation would simply be dismissed as false. Therefore, belief in God must precede belief in Scripture, not the other way around. Mankani then challenges Dawkins' assertion that there is no evidence for God's existence and that, quote, the question exists on a different plane or in a different dimension beyond the zones where evidence can reach, unquote. Dawkins also claims that philosophers consider the question of God's existence unanswerable regardless of what new evidence might emerge. Mankani strongly disagrees, pointing out that philosophers throughout history have debated God's existence using rational proofs. The issue, according to Mankani, is that materialists like Dawkins discount logical and rational proofs in favor of only sensory evidence. Mankani also criticizes Dawkins' comparisons of God to Russell's celestial teapot, the tooth fairy, Mother Goose, unicorns, and the flying spaghetti monster. He argues that these analogies did misrepresent the concept of God through straw man arguments that incorrectly define what they seek to disprove. God, Mankani asserts, is not just any supernatural being, but must satisfy specific definitional criteria. He says, the crux of the matter is that it is not possible to criticize something that one does not apprehend or comprehend. This is rationally impossible. One can only criticize or attack that which one understands, and the narrower the understanding, the easier it is to attack the thing. Mankani addresses Dawkins' question, but if science cannot answer some ultimate question: what makes anybody think that religion can? He suggests that this reveals that Dawkins has projected a God complex onto science, particularly evolutionary biology, elevating it to an ultimate truth. Mankani argues that there is no reason for a rational person to assume science can address life's ultimate questions, as science is limited to phenomena observable by the senses. Only a pure materialist would assume that human experience begins and ends with the five senses. Mankani then addresses Dawkins' rejection of non-overlapping magisteria based on Dawkins' assertion that a universe without a supernaturally intelligent creator is a very different kind of universe from one without. Mankani argues this reasoning is invalid because, from his perspective, a universe without a creator is rationally impossible. He explains, the difference between a universe with a god and a universe without one is that a universe without a god does not and cannot exist. This is because the universe is composite, and whatever is composite is contingent, and whatever is contingent ultimately requires a simple, actualized, necessary being to bring it into existence. Mankani then challenges Dawkins' claim that alleged miracles provide the strongest reason many believers have for their faith, and miracles by definition violate the principles of science. Mankani contends that miracles actually play a limited role in convincing people to believe in religion. To support this, he references the story of Moses, who performed miracles before Pharaoh, yet converted only a handful of magicians who had specialized knowledge to distinguish real miracles from illusions, and the majority of witnesses remained unconvinced. Mankani argues that miracles serve primarily to affirm for existing believers that God, who created natural laws, can also suspend them at will, demonstrating his continued presence and control. However, a believer's faith is fundamentally grounded in rational proofs that are grasped by the intellect rather than observed through scientific means. Mankani then critiques Dawkins' discussion of the Great Prayer Experiment, which tested prayer's effectiveness on surgical patients. In this experiment, churchgoers prayed for patients undergoing surgery, with participants divided into three groups: those receiving prayer without knowing, those not receiving prayer, and those receiving prayer and knowing about it. The experiment found no difference between prayed for and non-prayed for groups. Interestingly, those aware that they were being prayed for actually experienced more complications, which Dawkins suggested might be due to performance anxiety or uncertainty about their condition. Mankani argues that this experiment fundamentally misunderstands the nature of prayer. He explains that religious acts have their own requirements, very different from scientific experiments. A double-blind study is meaningless in religion because spiritual laws require the person praying to have sincere conviction in prayer's power. Doubt, implicit in an experimental setting, prevents prayer from working according to religious understanding. Lastly, Mankani finds value in Dawkins' explanation of how scientists detect exoplanets by observing the gravitational effects that they have on their parent stars. Mankani uses this to illustrate that not everything can be proven through direct evidence. Some existences are recognized only by their effects. Just as we accept the existence of exoplanets we cannot directly observe, we acknowledge that our inability to see them stems from our own limitations, not from any deficiency in the planets themselves. He extends this reasoning to God. If we can rationally accept that material objects might exist beyond our sensory capabilities, why not apply the same logic to the creator of the universe? He suggests it's entirely possible that scientists might eventually develop methods to observe the material effects of immaterial beings. He also criticizes Dawkins for prematurely answering this question with a definitive no when scientists are not even positioned to definitively rule out any material existence in the universe. He concludes, quote, "It makes clear to the reader the erroneous notion that Dawkins entertains about God and the universe. For Dawkins, evolution must come first, then God or the gods. He cannot imagine a God outside of and not limited by space-time. In reality, his God is the theory of evolution." Unquote.